and I'm really looking forward to sharing my work on autofiction today as talk number 804, I think, of the Brownback biography. So I will delve right in. When you saw the talk announced and saw that it would be on autofiction, you may have expected me to talk about Knausgård's Min Kampf series, perhaps especially since I'm visiting from Norway, a multi-volume life account of the author, but with several of his family members appearing under different names, and with the author exhibiting scarily detailed memory of conversations, clothing, food cooked, etc., but also at times reflecting on the fact that such detailed recall is realistically, in fact, impossible. Or perhaps you thought I might talk about Rachel Katz's outline trilogy, featuring an author character who is once in each book identified as Faye, so a different name from the authors, who's present mostly as a conversation partner for the stories of others, whose selves take up this book in the main. Or perhaps you thought I would talk about Jeanette Winterson's Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, where the protagonist is called Jeanette and the life story seems to be largely that of the author, but is also clearly combined with mythical interludes that have abstracting and universalizing functions. Winterson herself has referred to this book as an act of self-invention. Or perhaps, going back diachronically, as I will today, as Craig announced, you expected me to talk about Gertrude Stein's autobiography of Alice Vitocles, written in the voice of Alice, who talks more about Gertrude Stein than about herself, however, and with the famous ending in which Stein, although slightly ambiguously, does admit that she has written this autobiography for Alice. It's less likely that you expected me to talk about this text, I would assume, since autofiction is mostly discussed as a postmodern and contemporary phenomenon. And as Craig said, this is one of the interventions that I want to make in my research more broadly, namely to help extend the term autofiction diachronically and to show why this is productive. What the brief list of examples that I've just given shows, I hope, is how diverse the texts that we might discuss as autofiction are, and how difficult it is to find a clear definition. For example, based on onomastic correspondence or lettre of author and character share or do not share name, or on the basis of paratextual identification. Many of the texts that are listed are labeled clearly as novels, or on the basis of metafictional play, which is dominant really in none of the texts that I've just listed. Despite what I've just said, the first fairly short part of my talk is titled What is Autofiction? And in this part, I will comment on terminology, while I'm not myself attempting to find a better term or give a precise definition. I'll argue that despite the flaws that this term has, it is productive, and I will argue moreover that the slipperiness of the phenomenon requires a more holistic approach than is often still taken. I'll then, in the second part of my talk, make use of this approach to chart developments in forms and functions of autofictional modes from the 18th century to the 21st. So, what is autofiction and why do we need a holistic approach? In discussing autofictional practices, one, as Stefan Iversen notes, grapples with a type of narrative transgression that on the one hand is fairly easy to recognize, yet on the other, very hard to precisely pin down. Autofictional modes are certainly difficult to pin down, and they are also, I would argue, not always so easy to recognize. My interest, as I've said, is not in definitions per se, but I do feel fairly strongly about one point related to definitions. In my opinion, it is in many cases much more productive to use the adjective autofictional, because as an adjective, autofictional can denote a quality of texts or of particular elements within a text, and a quality of writing and reading modes. And I make this argument together with Hani Lawler in this edited volume that Craig mentioned. It's also open access, so if you get a chance to take a look. Autofictional elements are as difficult to pin down, however, as autofiction as a genre. And this is so since, in my understanding at least, neither semantic nor syntactic or pragmatic criteria are sufficient for defining something as autofictional. Neither purely textual criteria, this means, nor the author's intention alone, nor purely the reader's stance can determine whether something is autofictional. And this, I argue further, is why we need a holistic perspective. To understand autofictional phenomena, we need to consider authorial intention, we need to consider reading experience, and we need to consider textual and paratextual signals. We moreover need to see each text in its particular socio-historical context of production and reception. And to take such an approach also already means to take a cognitive approach, since it means to look at how texts originate in the author's mind and in how they exert effect on the minds of authors and of readers. In a monograph I'm working on, I draw up a theoretical framework that works with theories and empirical studies on discourse processing, theories on the cognitive process involved in creative writing, and with psychological research on autobiographical memory. This framework allows me to form theoretically substantiated hypotheses about potential effects of autofictional writing and reading. I'll spare you this theoretical baggage today, although it is at the background of what I'll say, and focus instead on conditions of publishing, on generic conventions, and on socio-historical pressures that are in place at a given time. And these too allow forming hypotheses about effect. We'll also look at likely and at times at professed authorial motivation. So one of the gains of this kind of more holistic approach that I want to advocate is that it allows us to better see autofictional modes in earlier centuries, and also to better see how they work in a given socio-historical and personal context. And this is the gain that I want to focus on today, which brings me to part 2 of the talk, namely to charting developments in autofictional forms and function. In terms of functions, our focus will be ambiguation, because keeping in mind the difficulty of defining autofiction, we can fairly safely say that autofictional texts present a portrait of the author, but also ambiguate that portrait. I'll focus today on developments in terms of what autofictional texts ambiguate, through which means and to which effect. In terms of forms, we'll have several focus points. We're also on fairly safe ground when we say that autofictional texts are, by definition, both rooted in historical reality and artistically crafted. They often make these competing claims by drawing attention to both a naturalistic storytelling situation at the origin of a given text or of part of the text, and by drawing attention also to how the book as artifact has been shaped by the author. We'll focus on how these competing claims are made at different times in literary history. So how do texts at different times foreground medium that they are a book, for example, or that they contain or are made up of letters, transcripts, emails, etc. And we'll focus moreover on developments in genre signaling and meta-narrative or metafictional commentary, which is often thought to be the prominent feature of autofiction. A brief outlook. As regards medium, I'll argue the following. We start with texts that foreground an allegedly historical artifact of the text spaces. Then we move on to texts that foreground the medium of the creatively crafted book, sometimes also as containing various ego documents. And towards the new millennium, we move on to texts that foreground the crafted book as still in the process of being written very often, and as containing various ego documents. As regards means of creating ambiguity, generic signaling, and the functions that this serves, I'll argue that we move from ambiguation through pseudo-disguise to ambiguation through explicit displacement, what one might also call a development from masking to masquerade, hence the title of my talk. This distinction from masking to masquerade stems from Jerome McGann's analysis of Byron's work initially, and McGann stresses that masquerades are interpersonal and social, which James Treadwell, writing about the Romantic period, takes up to describe the masquerade as a performance in which the performer himself is present alongside his disguises. So if we use these terms to think about autofiction, we could say that the autofictional masquerade can be understood as conscious and signaled role play. It involves author, impersonated character or characters, and audience. Autofictional masking is more subtle a largely autobiographical text shaped through novelistic means, or a largely fictional text subtly inviting autobiographical reading. Okay, now let us turn to the development, first from masking to masquerade, and then also to developments in the kinds of masquerade that we find, as they are underpinned by developments in generic signaling, meta-commentary, and foregrounding of medium. Let's begin with forms. In the 18th century, in the first half especially, the genre categories of autobiography and novel are not yet firmly established. Unsurprisingly, therefore, autofictional texts during this period do not signal hypergeneric status as they might today. Autofictional texts of the period do signal, however, that they present a portrait of the author and that this portrait has been creatively shaped. In fact, I start my account of autofiction and diachronic perspective in the 18th century because I believe that autofictional forms first properly appear linked to the emergent author concept at that time. That concept makes it necessary to market the author and to market him or her as author of a creatively shaped work, which autofictional texts often do. Let us look at two examples from that time. Della Riviere Manley's Adventures of Rivella is initially published anonymously and masks identities, including that of the author, in a remarkable fashion. Rivella is a fairly diaphanous anagram, however, and reference to other of Manley's works also make clear who the text is about and who it is by. The text is presented as a conversation about Manley/Rivella between two men, who at times exhibit realistically impossible narrative omniscience. Especially if one is aware of the fact that Manley has written the text, this frame emphasizes what we would nowadays refer to as fictional quality. Alexander Pope offers self-portraits in many of his verse epistles and signals them to be both autobiographical and artistically crafted. The epistle to Arbuthnot is a good example. In the preface to the second volume of his works, the collection of his works, Pope explicitly presents this epistle as autobiographical. He states at the very bottom, you see that all I have to say of myself will be found in my last epistle, which is the epistle to Arbuthnot. Yet the form of the verse epistle emphasizes that this is a crafted, we would say, a fictionalized artifact, however. That's the beginning. Here we see kind of what shape this text takes. As far as medium is concerned, we must keep in mind that during the first half of the 18th century, the novel, or one should rather say novelistic precursors, largely consist of textual formats from naturalistic storytelling situations. Usually these are diaries, letters, and slightly less naturalistic memoirs. Texts create the illusion, albeit a more or less transparent illusion, that one is reading an actual historical document, or at least an account based in such a document. Texts create this illusion by foregrounding the medium of the alleged historical letter, the diary, or the transcript, and they do so because authority and value is believed to inhere in what is real. The convention imposes fairly strict limitations, however, on how authors can shape a text. It basically prevents them from showcasing their role as author, showcasing their craft. Now, autofictional texts cleverly find a way of foregrounding the medium they are ostensibly made up of, but also of foregrounding craft. And we can again use Manley and Pope as examples here. So Rivella is presented as a transcription of a conversation, as I've said, and the frontispiece supports this transparent illusion. It depicts the alleged conversation between Charles Lovemore and the Chevalier Dumont. We see them here at Somerset House. The title page also tells us that this is an account of Rivella as delivered by Lovemore in conversation. But we also perceive Manley as behind this alleged conversation and as having crafted it for us. Pope stresses historical rootedness through the letter format. In the preface to the 1737 letters, he stresses the text's basis in a very material artifact. He presents the author as the victim to vicious booksellers who encourage servants to, and this is the passage in red, who encourage servants to snatch a letter from your pocket, unquote. The letter as material object is foregrounded here, yet the form of the verse epistles in particular very clearly foregrounds artistic craft. He claims the right to shape his material for aesthetic effect and in divergence from effects, and he shows us that this is his skill. Now, let us look at how 19th century texts signal generic belonging, and at the metafictional or meta-narrative commentary that they contain. At that time, genre categories are much more firmly established, and autofictional hybridity experiments within these more settled generic categories. Autofictional texts now tell us, albeit still through fairly subtle signals, pronoun use, stylistic elements, the odd meta-commentary, that they combine fictional and autobiographical elements. And again, I'll give 2 examples. Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Aurora Leigh is a blank verse poem, which in over 11,000 lines recounts the first-person narrator's life from birth to age 13. There are parallels in terms of biographical details between author and character, but also differences. Autobiographical parallels are signaled, for one, through the Künstlerroman form. We learn about Aurora's personal development and about her development as author. And there are also long reflections on art and on poetry, including on the composition of an autobiographical epic poem. Passages in the first-person singular easily let us forget whether author or character is speaking. And those in the first-person plural make the difference almost irrelevant. So we are led to wonder, for instance, is it Barrett Browning or Aurora who asks what forms best for poems? Could be either. Who tells us, I set myself to art, and asks us to admire the result? Behold, at last the book. To state that lifeblood is required for her kind of writing, that it is fertilizing too, and that I wrung mine on every leaf of this. In this last quote, that the demonstrative pronoun double-dictically refers both to what Aurora is writing and to Barrett Browning's book increases the ambiguity. Generic hybridity is signaled yet more explicitly in this book, already in the title, in fact. Eliza Lynn Linton gives an account of her life in the form of the autobiography of Christopher Kirkland. There are references to the narrator's maleness interspersed throughout the text. When I should be a man, I will not be like other men. For a young fellow as I was then, had I not been an Englishman, etc. However, because the book is told in first-person narration, which in English is of course gender neutral, and because biographical details and opinions are recognizably Linton's, it is quite easy to lose sight of these reminders, and it becomes ambiguous whose autobiography this is. Now, what are the functions of this interplay? There are a range. One of them, that the ambiguation of autofictional writing in the 18th and 19th century is in part a response to the disreputability of autobiographical writing and to the need to market the author's author. So the function is that where straightforward self-presentation seems presumptuous, half-hearted disguise is a way out. Ambiguation serves as a pretense to modesty and to also market the autofictional author. If we think of Manley, by masking her self-portrait as a conversation between 2 men, she retains a pretense to modesty. It is strictly speaking the men who praise her after all. And it is seemingly not she who publishes her self-portrait. The story is that the gentleman of the chamber to one of these men composed the transcript. The effect remains, even though readers in general would have recognized the text to have been written by Manley, and later editions also make this explicit. Since we do know who is behind the text, Manley can also showcase her skill as a writer, and just to make sure the men also praise her writing. Pope makes use of the letter format to a similar effect. He is bold with the times in claiming the right to publish self-portraits in the first place, and even more bold in claiming the right to artificially form them. He too disguises half-heartedly that he is immodest enough to do so, however. The letter form is a see-through pretense to be writing only for a select addressee, while their shaping shows his epistles to be intentional self-presentation and tells us to admire his craft. Barrett Browning, moving on diachronically too, feels that self-presentation is unseemly, and this seems to have been one motivating factor for the autofictional form that she chooses. She describes autobiographical writing as, quote, a task generally dictated by extreme vanity. This is from a very early essay that she writes.
Writing about Aurora is, or at least appears, less vain. It also allows Barrett Browning to promote her prose poem by integrating an account of the reception of auroras, which is of course well received. Autofictional pseudo-disguise during the 18th and 19th century also often serves as a safety measure. An autofictional mode allows authors to potentially disown what has been said by them and what has been revealed about them. Mainly for one needs the autofictional ambiguation as protection from the libel laws. The autofictional mode, moreover, constitutes clever political maneuvering on her side. She writes at a time of political upheaval. One needed to be able to quickly switch sides. Prior to Ribella, she's known as a Tory propagandist. But with the death of Queen Anne imminent, she uses Ribella to potentially be able to promote herself as a writer for the opposed party, for the Whig. And Manley has Lovemore, who has a character and narrative function past judgment on her previous Tory propaganda book, The New Atlantis. So he describes it as, quote, a heinous offense and notorious indiscretion, end of quote. Manley can refer to the statement as expressing her own values, attesting to Whig affinity and regret for her earlier work, but she can also distance herself from the judgment as merely Lovemore's. Rivella in Some is a self-portrait that allows its author to, depending on what is opportune, don one mask or another. Linton makes use of the autofictional ambiguation to half-heartedly hide, but also express her self-experience as a professional, active, and homosexual woman. She has to align this part of her character with societal conventions and with her own very conservative beliefs about the role of women in general. She believed that women should stay in the house. Her homosexual relations and career ambitions become acceptable when transferred onto Christopher. So she, one can say, half-heartedly masks dimensions of her character that she could not publicly accept, but apparently still wanted to put in print somehow. Now back to forms. Over the course of the 19th century, authors more consciously work with boundaries and overlaps between fictional and autobiographical modes, but generic questions are not yet a primary concern. This changes over the course of the 20th century, especially in the second half, but already during the modernist period, we see more and more blatantly overdetermined texts. They boldly state belonging to the genres of novel and autobiography simultaneously, and they often include metafictional, or at least extensive meta-narrative commentary. This is a good example, the preface to Christopher Isherwood's Lions and Shadows. A note to the reader at the beginning of the book stresses that this is not in the ordinary journalistic sense of the word an autobiography. It contains no revelations, it is never indiscreet, it is not even entirely true. The protagonist merely a young man living at a certain period in a certain European country who is subjected to a certain kind of environment, certain stimuli, certain influences, and the fact that he happens to be myself only of secondary importance. The very distancing from conventional autobiography also functions as an invitation to read autobiographically, of course. And then in the postmodernist period, unsettling of genre categories becomes only more dominant. Philip Roth, for example, announces the combination of novel and autobiography in the title of what he calls in the subtitle, A Novelist's Autobiography, and in the main title, The Facts, ironically, of course. What follows is a seemingly straightforward autobiographical account of a period of Roth's life, framed, however, by two letters that offer a meta-commentary. In these letters, a Roth character and a Nathan Zuckerman, an alter ego familiar from other of Roth's books, discuss the truth status of the main body of the text. They ask whether fiction serves better to tell truth and comment on conscious and unconscious acts of distortion and fictionalization. This book too, Christine Brick-Rose's remake, is full of meta-commentary. A formally experimental text written without personal pronouns and possessives. It features various alter ego versions of the author. For example, a version referred to as the old lady and another referred to as Tess, to evoke the tiles and bits of text that the self is made up of. Here two quotes on this wordplay. The upper quote is what Brick-Rose writes within Remake, and the bottom one, what she says about the wordplay in an essay. These alter egos and additional ones discuss limitations of representation and of the genre of autobiography. They too, as do the countervoices in Roth's book, discuss whether fiction is a better form. And in so doing, they make the text's generic ambiguity a central focus. In terms of foregrounding of medium, we can note that especially from the second half of the 20th century onwards, autofictional texts integrate alleged or real documents intermittently. And they foreground also the medium of the book in which they appear. They foreground in particular how it is creatively shaped and how, in the process, the integrated documents may also have undergone transformation. In the facts, for example, the middle part is in fact presented as a manuscript written by a text internal Roth, as an attempt at quote-unquote undisguised autobiography. This alleged manuscript is framed by the two letters, one from Roth, or Roth character, to Zuckerman, and another from Zuckerman to that Roth character. So all of these texts can be considered to have moved on to a stage of explicit autofictional displacement. Now, what are the functions of this kind of ambiguation? Texts like Isherwood's, and even more so Roth's and Bergrose's, serve to destabilize reading modes. They challenge the genre of autobiography explicitly, and the truth status of these texts themselves, as well as the truth status of those of others. They draw our attention to the interplay and to cross-influence between real-life experience and imaginative, including fictional stories that we narrate or are the recipients of. These texts, too, create a non-committal speaking position, but arguably less because of legal or reputational issues. Here, the hesitancy to pass final and authoritative judgment is rather what one might say is an acknowledgement of the fact that definite truth, even or perhaps particularly about the self, is not to be had. Roth's acts of masquerade and the facts, for example, mean that the real person remains hidden, while one is invited to perceive and chase him behind multiple semi-transparent masks. Foregrounding of real-world document and creatively shaped book together serve to show the author's power as editor, transformer, sometimes even inventor of his life story and identity. It serves to destabilize any attempts to read a given text for definite truth. The letters point to distortions and fictionalizations of the manuscript, but also discuss the possibility that the truest autobiography may be found in fiction. The effect is to make us aware of the potential truth, but also the potential distortion in all of these documents and in the book they form part of. Since all three documents are, of course, created by the actual Roth, we are made aware also of Roth's power to shape his life story, or at least to shape its public presentation. In Remake, acts of masquerade are a form of displacement of self that serves to acknowledge the unavailability of autobiographical truth and of stable identity, and especially the slipperiness of the self as represented in writing. As the old lady says in a dialogue with Tess at the very end of the book, she's asked whether what she has written constitutes, quote unquote, a betrayal, and she answers, quote, biographies like that always is. So we've reached the 21st century, where we can see that texts that explicitly signal their fictional and their autobiographical genre affiliation and that include metafictional commentary continue. But we also see texts that, closer actually to conventions of the 18th century, are not particularly bothered by generic categories and corresponding signals. Dame Coetzee's Summertime belongs to the former. In this book, we find alleged or real diary entries written by a younger John, and we also find transcriptions of interviews in different stages of editing. The fictional story is that a biographer interviews acquaintances of the, in this book, late John Coetzee, in view of composing a biographer. And in fact, we discussed this book briefly last week with a biographer who was here. In presenting material that is to form part of a future book, Summertime belongs to a specific form of autofictional text, which we find fairly frequently in the 21st century. The book project that is still in progress, which foregrounds its status as unfinished manuscript, has become quite popular nowadays. And I'll briefly discuss two more examples of this form. Ben Lerner's 1004 also belongs to the strongly metafictional kind of 21st century autofictional text. It is subtitled a novel. It refers to the character narrator as Ben in one instance, and it aligns him with the historical author through many biographical details. We follow him in his daily musings and actions, which are in part directed towards how he can turn a short story reprinted in the middle of the book into a book project for which he has received a large advance. At some point, we learn of his decision to, quote, replace the book I had proposed with the book you're reading now. He also tells us that this work is neither fiction or non-fiction, but a flickering between them. Sheila Hetty's How Should a Person Be is made up of first-person reflections on the side of Sheila, dialogue, mostly between Sheila and her friend Margot, emails and short passages in present tense similar to stage direction. The frame story for these piecemeal types of prose is that Sheila has been commissioned to write a play about women and starts recording bits of her life, explicitly conversations with Margot, hoping that the material will help her write her play. The material is also structured into acts in which we find subdivisions into chapters, so both play and book are sort of visually represented in that form. Learners, or strictly speaking, Ben's next book, Hetty's, or strictly speaking, Sheila's play, and Coetzee's, or rather Mr. Vincent's auto/biographical book, are all depicted as unfinished, despite the fact that we are holding a published book in our hand. Hetty, amongst the three, also exemplifies the kind of contemporary autofictionist for whom genre affiliation and questions of fictionality are not actually a prominent concern. Sheila and her friends are clearly recognizable from the art scene in Toronto, where Hetty lives and works, and the book is titled A Novel from Life in the US edition, but only because the US publisher deemed the label necessary to, quote unquote, help readers. Hetty herself instead maintains a distance between her textual self, her text external self and the character, but that difference is not her concern. When asked by an interviewer whether he can refer to her interchangeably with the character, Hetty replies, "Sure, I don't care, they're not the same, but I don't care." And Hetty moreover says that in writing this book, she didn't care about fiction or non-fiction, but merely wanted to answer the question of the book's title. So this is what mattered to her, and she would use everything that she could in view of doing so. I've not given the typographical dimension of these texts attention so far, but I want to briefly mention that they too foreground the text types that they seemingly integrate through textual layout, fonts, italics, etc. So Coetzee, for example, renders the transcripts of the biographer's interviews like this. And here we learn of Sheila's plans to record her conversations, and that what follows seems to be a transcript of those recordings. However, the initial stage direction-like description suggests that these are not the original recordings, but materials shaped for Sheila's play. And here's how Hetty renders typographically an email that she or her character receives. And finally, an interesting example of how 1004 foregrounds the materiality of the book that the narrator is ostensibly in the process of writing. So in this passage, he's walking through Brooklyn with a friend, and they see a light coming from the financial district. The narrator refers us to, quote, photographs in which one of the few illuminated buildings in the skyline was the investment banking firm Goldman Sachs, an image I'd used for the cover of my book, not the one I was contracted to write about fraudulence, but the one I've written in its place for you, to you, on the very edge of which. Now, maybe you remember, if we look at the book we are holding in our hands as we are reading, we see just this picture and become aware of the fact that the material artifact that the narrator character is planning to write is in fact the one that Lynn has written and that we are reading. In Coetzee's, Lerner's, and Hetty's text, we see yet new functions of autofictional masquerades. In Summertime, foregrounding of real-world document and creatively shaped book together serves to show how multiple people can transform stories and meanings in the process of narrativization and interpretation. Again, the fact that all the sources, diary entries, interview transcriptions, narrativized interviews, are presented to us as created by Coetzee shows the author's authority to shape his self-presentation, but the book also demonstrates his lack of authority, or his willingness to cede authority amongst the many other voices that tell, edit, and transform how the self is seen. 1004 explores how smaller and larger changes in narratives can bring about change in the world. The book asks whether what the narrator refers to as quote-unquote transpositions for example, from life into art, and what can also be understood as masquerades can change present and future. Sheila contemplates whether art can do any good in the world, and specific whether better art will make her a better person, or whether, quote unquote, going to Africa or giving blowjobs are worthy occupations. So these books, through how they foreground ego document in the process of still being creatively shaped, draw attention to the possibility of continuously transforming self and life, or at least the story one tells oneself and others about oneself and the world. For these authors, narrativization of self, be it in writing a novel or in everyday acts of self-performance, is recognized to be a masquerade, and creative self-invention, as in writing fiction, is recognized to be one possible way of effecting change, a way of potentially changing oneself and effecting change in the world. The approach that I've argued for demands thinking about which context these particular forms and functions emerge in. This helps to see how autofictional texts intervene in very different personal as well as sociocultural media and generic contexts. It shows, for example, how autofictional modes emerge in part as response to the new market system of the 18th century, or how the contemporary boom responds to a newly digitized and increasingly virtual age of the 21st. I'll only mention this very briefly, since I know that there are some people here at CBR working in specific on online digital life writing. In a different paper, I've argued that the in-process books, such as those of Hetty and Lerner, for example, can insightfully be read in the context of new 21st century media ecologies, bringing new understandings of the morphing nature of self, new temporalities, new collaborative ways of forming and transforming self, etc. But yeah, that's material for different papers. So for today, I'll close here and look forward to hearing your thoughts on all of this.
Thank you. Anyone?